Section 2 of The Pastor's Wife. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Section 2. He gazed very benevolently at the little figure on the edge of the view. Why not marry her now, and frugally convert the tail end of Dent's excursion into a honeymoon? With the large simplicity and obliviousness to bans and licenses of a man of scientific preoccupations, he saw no reason against this course. It was obvious. It was desirable. It would not only save her going back to England first, it would save the extra journey there for him. They would go straight home to East Prussia together at the end of the week. And as for doing it without her family's knowledge, if she could run away from them as she had told him she had done just for the sake of a jaunt, how much more readily, with what increase of swiftness indeed, would she run for the sake of a husband? "Tell me, little one," he said, when she rejoined him, "will you marry me?" Chapter 4. Ingeborg was astonished. She stared at him speechless. The gulf between even the warmest friendliness and marriage. She had, she knew, been daily increasing in warm friendliness towards him, characteristically expecting nothing back. That he too should grow warm had not remotely occurred to her. Nobody had ever grown warm to her in that way. There had always been Judith, that miracle of beauty, to blot her into plainness. It is true, the senior curate of the Redchester parish church had said to her once in his exhausted Oxford voice, "You know, I don't mind about faces. Will you marry me?" And she had refused so gingerly, with such a fear of hurting his feelings, that for a week he had supposed he was engaged. But one would not call that warmth. As the sun puts out the light of a candle, so did the radiance of Judith extinguish Ingeborg. They were so oddly alike, and Ingeborg was the pale, diminished shadow. Judith was Ingeborg, grown tall, grown exquisite. Ingeborg, wrought wonderfully in ivory and gold. No man could possibly fall in love with Ingeborg, while there before his very eyes was apparently exactly the same girl, only translated into loveliness. From the first it had been the most natural thing in the world to Ingeborg to be plain and passed over. Judith was always beside her. Whenever there was a pause in her work for her father, it was filled by the chaperoning of Judith. She accepted the situation with complete philosophy, for nothing was quite so evident as Judith's beauty. And she used, in corners at parties, to keep herself awake by saying over bits of the Psalms, on which, not being allowed to read novels, her literary enthusiasms were concentrated. It was, then, really a very astonishing thing to a person practised in this healthy and useful humility to have someone asking her to marry him. That it should be Herr Dremmel seemed to her even more astonishing. He didn't look like somebody one married. He didn't even look like somebody who wanted to marry one. He sat there, his hands folded on the knob of his stick, gazing at her with an entirely placid benevolence, and asked her the surprising question as though it were a way of making conversation. It is true he had not called her little one before, but that, she felt as she stood before him, considering this thing that had happened to her, was pretty rather than impassioned. Here was an awkward and odd result of her holiday enterprise. "It's very unexpected," she said lamely. "Yes," he agreed, "it is unexpected. It has greatly surprised me." "I am very sorry," she said. "About what are you sorry, little one?" "I can't accept your offer." "What? There is some one else?" "Not that sort of some one. But there's my father." He made a great sweep with his arm. "Fathers," he said, and pushed the whole breed out of sight. "He's very important." "Important? Little one, when will you marry me?" "I can't leave him." He became patient. "It has been laid down that a woman shall leave father and mother and any other related obstacle she may have the misfortune to be hampered with, and cleave only to her husband." That was about a man cleaving to his wife. There wasn't anything said about a woman. Besides " She stopped. She couldn't tell him that she didn't want to cleave. He gazed at her a moment in silence. He had not contemplated a necessity for persuasion. "This," he then said with severity, "is prevarication." She sat down on the grass and clasped her hands round her knees and looked up at him. She had taken off her hat when first she got to the top to fan herself, and had not put it on again. As she sat there with her back to the glow of the sky, the wind softly lifted the rings of her hair, and the sun shone through them wonderfully. They seemed to flicker gently to and fro, little tongues of fire. "Why," said Herr Dremmel, suddenly leaning forward and staring, "you are like a spirit." This pleased her. For a moment her eyes danced. "Like a spirit," he repeated, "and here I am talking heavily to you as though you were an ordinary woman. Little one, how does one trap a spirit into marrying? Tell me, for very earnestly do I desire to be shown the way." "One doesn't," said Ingeborg. "Ah, do not be difficult. You have been so easy, of such a comfortable response in all things up to now." "But this," began Ingeborg. "Yes, this I well know." He was more stirred than he had thought possible. He was becoming almost eager. "But," asked Ingeborg, exploring this new interesting situation, "why do you want to?" "Want to marry you? Yes, because," said Herr Dremmel, immensely prompt, "I have had the extreme good fortune to fall in love with you." Again she looked pleased. "And I do not ask you," he went on, "to love me, or whether you do love me. It would be presumption on my part, and not, if you did, very modest on yours. That is the difference between a man and a woman. He loves before marriage, and she does not love till after." "Oh?" said Ingeborg, interested. "And what does he, the woman," continued Herr Dremmel, "feels affection and esteem before marriage, and the man feels affection and esteem after." "Oh," said Ingeborg, reflecting. She began to tear up tufts of grass. "It seems chilly," she said. "Chilly?" he echoed. He let his stick drop and got up and came and sat down, or rather let himself down carefully, on the grass beside her. "Chilly? Do you not know that a decent chill is a great preservative? Hot things decay. Frozen things do not live. A just measure of chill preserves the life of the affections. It is by a very proper dispensation of nature provided before marriage by the woman, and afterwards by the man. The balance is, in this way, nicely held, and peace and harmony, which nourish best at a low temperature, prevail." She looked at him and laughed. There was no one in Redchester, and Redchester was all she knew of life, in the least like Herr Dremmel. She stretched herself in the roomy difference, happy, free, at her ease. "But I cannot believe," burst out Herr Dremmel with a passionate vigour, that astonished him more than anything in his whole life, as he seized the hand that kept on tearing up grass. "I cannot believe that you will not marry me. I cannot believe that you will refuse a good and loving husband, that you will prefer to remain with your father and solidify into yet one more frost-bitten virgin." "Into a what?" repeated Ingeborg, struck by this image of herself in the future. She began to laugh, then stopped. She stared at him, her grey eyes very wide open. She forgot Herr Dremmel, and that he was still clutching her hand and all the grass in it, while her mind flashed over the years that had gone and the years that were to come. They would be alike. They had not been able to frostbite her yet because she had been too young, but they would get her presently. Their daily repeated busy emptiness, their rush of barren duties, their meagre moments of what when she was younger used to be happiness but had lately only been relief, those rare moments when her father praised her, would settle down presently and freeze her dead. Her face grew solemn. "It's true," she said slowly. "I shall be a frost-bitten virgin. I'm doomed. My father won't ever let me marry." "You infinitely childish one," he cried, becoming angry. "When it is well known that all fathers wish to get rid of all daughters." "You don't understand. It's different. My father why," she broke out, "I used to dose myself secretly with cod liver oil so as to keep up to his level. He's wonderful. When he praised me I usedn't to sleep, and if he scolded me it seemed to send me lame." Herr Dremmel sawed her hand up and down in his irritation. "What is this irrelevant talk?" he said. "I offer you marriage, and you respond with information about cod liver oil. I do not believe the father obstacle. I do not recognise my honest little friend of these last days. It is waste of time, not being open. Would you then, if it were not for your father, marry me?" "But," Ingeborg flashed round at him, swept off her feet as she so often was by an impulse of utter truth, "it's because of him that I would." And the instant she had said it she was shocked. She stared at Herr Dremmel, wide-eyed with contrition. The disloyalty of it, the ugliness of telling a stranger, and a stranger with hair like fur, anything at all about those closely related persons she had been taught to describe to herself as her dear ones. "Oh," she cried, dragging her hand away, "let my hand go. Let my hand go." She tried to get on to her feet, but with an energy he did not know he possessed he pulled her down again. He did not recognise any of the things he was feeling and doing. The Dremmel of his real nature, of those calm depths where lay happy fields of future fertilizers, gazed at this inflamed conduct going on at the top in astonishment. "No," he said with immense determination, "you will sit here and explain about your father." "It's a dreadful thing," replied Ingeborg, suddenly discovering that of all things she did not like being clutched, and looking straight into his eyes, her head a little thrown back, "that one can't leave one's home even for a week without getting into a scrape." "A scrape? You call it a scrape, when a good man here's a person who goes away for a little change, privately, and before she knows where she is she's being held down on the top of the Rigi and ordered by a strange man, by her future husband," cried Herr Dremmel, who was finding the making of offers more difficult than he had supposed, "by a strange man to explain her father. As though anybody could ever explain their father. As though anybody could ever explain anything." "God in heaven," cried Herr Dremmel, "do not explain him then. Just marry me." And at this moment the snake-like procession of the rest of Dent's Tour, headed by Mr. Ascough, watch in hand, emerged from the hotel where it had been having tea on to the plateau, wiping its mouths in readiness for the sunset. With the jerk of a thing that has been stung, it swerved aside as it was about almost to tread on the two on the grass. Ingeborg sat very stiff and straight, and pretended to be staring intently at the view, forgetting that it was behind her. She flushed when she found there was no time to move far enough from Herr Dremmel for a gap to be visible between them. "Look at those two now," whispered the young lady last in the procession to the young man, brushing bread and butter out of his tie, who walked beside her. He looked and seemed inclined to linger. "She's very pretty, isn't she?" he said. "Oh, do you think so?" said his companion. "I never think anybody's pretty who isn't. You know what I mean. Really nice, you know, ladylike." And she hurried him on, because, she said, if he didn't hurry he'd miss the sunset. Chapter 5. Ingeborg spent most of the night on a hard chair at her bedroom window earnestly endeavouring to think. It was very unfortunate, but she found an immense difficulty at all times in thinking. She could keep her father's affairs in the neatest order, but not her own thoughts. There were so many of them, and they all seemed to jump about inside her and want to get thought first. They would not go into ordered rows. They had no patience. Often she had suspected they were not thoughts at all, but just feelings, and that depressed her, for it made her drop, she feared, to the level of the insect world and enter the category of things that were not going to be able to get to heaven. And to a bishop's daughter this was disquieting. Most of her thoughts she was immediately sorry for. They were so unlike anything she could, with propriety, say out loud at home. To Herr Dremmel she had been able to say them all as far as speech, a limping vehicle, could be made to go. And this was another of his refreshing qualities. She did not, of course, know of that absorbed man's habit of listening to her with only one ear, a benevolent ear, but only one, while with the other, turned inwards, he listened to the working out in his mind of problems in chilisaltpetre and superphosphates. She sat staring out of the window at the stars and chimney pots, her hands held tightly in her lap, and told herself that the moment had come for clear consecutive thought, she repeated severely, aware already of the interlaced dancing going on in her brain. What was she going to do about Herr Dremmel? About going home? About anything. They had come down the Rigi soberly and in the train. Nobody, as usual, spoke to them, and for the first time in their friendship neither had they spoken to each other. They had had a speechless dinner. He had looked preoccupied, and when directly after she had said good night he had drawn her out into the passage and solemnly adjured her, while the hall porter pretended he was out of earshot, to have done with prevarications. What he would suggest, he said, was a comfortable betrothal next day. It was too late for one that night, he said, pulling out his watch, but next day. And as she retreated sideways, step by step up the stairs, silent through an inability immediately to find an answer that seemed tactful enough, he had eyed her very severely and inquired of her with a raised voice what, then, the ado was all about. She had turned at that, giving up the search for tact, and had run up the remaining stairs rather breathlessly, feeling that Herr Dremmel on marriage had an engulfing quality. and he, after a moment's perplexity on the mat at the bottom, had gone to the reading room, a baffled man. Now she sat at the window considering. Her journey home was only 2 days off, and the thought of what would be said to her when she got there, and of what her answers would be like, ran down the back of her neck and spine as though some one were drawing a light ice-cold finger over the shrinking skin. She had been persuading herself that her little holiday was harmless and natural, and now this business with Herr Dremmel would, she felt, do away with all that, and justify a wrath in her father that she might, else for her private solace and encouragement, have looked upon as unreasonable. It is a peculiarity of parents, reflected Ingeborg, that they are always being justified. However small and innocent what you are doing may be, if they disapprove, something turns up to cause them to have been altogether right. She remembered little things, small occasions of her younger days. This was a big occasion, and what had turned up on it was Herr Dremmel. It was a pity, oh, it was a pity she hadn't considered before she left London so impulsively, whether when she got back to Redchester she was going to be untruthful or not. She had considered nothing except the acuteness of the joy of running away. Now she was faced by the really awful question of lying or not lying. It was ugly to lie at all. It was dreadful to lie to one's father. But to lie to a bishop raised the operation from just a private sin which God would deal with kindly on being asked, to a crime you were punished for if it was a cathedral you did it to, a real crime, the crime of sacrilege. Impossible to profane a sacred and consecrated object like a bishop. Doubly and trebly impossible if you were that object's own daughter. Her tightly folded hands went cold as she realized she was undoubtedly going to be truthful. She was every bit as valiant as her Swedish grandmother had been, that grandmother who was aware of the dangers of the things she did with her mountains and her gusty lakes and defied them, but her grandmother knew no fear, and Ingeborg knew it very well. Hers was the real courage found only in the entirely terrified, who, terrified, yet see the thing, whatever it is, doggedly through. She was faint, yet pursuing. She saw much terror in her immediate future. She dreaded having to be courageous. She felt she was too small really for the bravely truthful answering of her magnificent father's questions. He would have the catechism and the confirmation service on his side, as well as the laws of right behaviour and filial love. It didn't seem fair. One couldn't argue with a parent, one couldn't answer back, while as for a bishop one couldn't do anything at all with him except hastily agree. There was just a possibility, but how remote, that her father would be too busy to ask questions. She sighed as she reflected how little she could count on that, and how the most superficial inquiry about her aunt or the dentist would bring out the whole story. And here was Herr Dremmel, who thought nothing at all of him, even in regard to an enormous undertaking like his daughter's marriage. There was something sublime in such detachment. She felt the largeness of the freedom of it blowing in her face like a brisk invigorating wind. There seemed to be no hedges round Herr Dremmel. He was as untied up a person as she had ever met. He cared nothing for other people's opinion, that chief enslavement of her home, and he was an orphan. Sad to be an orphan, thought Ingeborg, sighing. Sad, of course, not to have any dear ones, but it did seem to be a condition that avoided the dilemma whose horns were concealment by means of untruths and the screwing up of oneself to that clammily cold and forlorn condition, having courage. Of course, Herr Dremmel didn't know her father. He hadn't faced that impressive personality. Would he be quite so detached and easily indifferent if he had? She thought with a shiver of what such a meeting, supposing, just for the sake of supposing, that she allowed herself to become engaged, would be like. Would Herr Dremmel, in that setting of carefully subdued splendour, of wainscoting and oriels, seem to her as free and delightful as he seemed on a tour of frugal backgrounds? Would she, in the presence of the Bishop's horrified disapproval, be able to see him as she had been seeing him now? She had not explored very far into her own resources yet, but she had begun lately to perceive that she was pliable. She bent easily, she felt, and deplored having to feel in the direction desired by the persons she was with, and who laid hold of her with authority. It is true she sprang back again, as she had discovered so surprisingly in London, the instant the hold was relaxed, but it seemed that she sprang only to do, as she now with a headshake admitted, difficulty-bringing things. And her training in acquiescence and distrust of herself was very complete, and back in her home would she not at once bend into the old curve again? Was it possible, would it ever be possible, in her father's presence, to disassociate herself from his points of view? What his view of Herr Dremmel would be, she very exactly knew. Did she want to disassociate herself from it? She pushed back her chair and began to walk quickly up and down the narrow little room. If she didn't disassociate herself it meant marriage, and marriage in stark defiance of the whole of her world. Redchester would be appalled, the diocese would grieve for its bishop, the county would discuss her antagonistically at 100 tea tables. Well, and while they were doing it, where would she be? Her blood began suddenly to dance. She was seized, as she had been in London, by that overwhelming desire to shake off old things and set her face towards the utterly new. While all these people were nodding and whispering in their stuffy stale world, she would be safe in East Prussia, a place that seemed infinitely remote, a place Herr Dremmel had described to her as full of forests and water and immense stretches of waving rye. The lakes were fringed with rushes, the forests came down to their edges. His own garden ended in a little path through a lilac hedge that took you down between the rye to the rushes and the water and the first great pines. Oh, she knew it as though she had seen it. She had lured him on so often to describing it to her. He thought nothing of it, talked indeed of it with disgust as a God-forsaken place. Well, it was these God-forsaken places that her body and spirit cried out for. Space, freedom, quiet, the wind ruffling the rye, the water splashing softly against the side of the punt. There was a punt she had extracted. The larks singing up in the sunlight, the shining clouds passing slowly across the blue. She wanted to be alone with these things after the years of deafening hurry at Redchester, with a longing that was like homesickness. She remembered, somehow, that once she used to be with them, long ago, far away, and there used to be little things when you lay face downwards on the grass, little lovely things that smelt beautiful, wild strawberry leaves, and a tiny aromatic plant with a white flower like a star that you rubbed between your fingers. She stood still a moment, frowning, trying to remember more. It wasn't in England. But even as she puzzled the vision slipped away from her and was lost. She wanted to read and walk and think. She was hungry to read at last what she chose, and walk at last where she chose, and think at last exactly what she chose. Was the Christian Year enough for one in the way of poetry? And all those mild novels her mother read, sandwiched between the biographies of more bishops and little books of comfort with crosses on them that asked rude questions as to whether you had been greedy or dainty or had used words with a double meaning during the day. Were they enough for a soul that had, quite alone, with no father giving directions, presently to face its God? Her family held strongly that for daughters to read in the daytime was to be idle. Well, if it was, thought Ingeborg, lifting her head, that drooped so apologetically at home, with a defiance that distance encourages, then being idle was a blessed thing, and the sooner one got away to where one could be it uninterruptedly, the better. In that parsonage, away in East Prussia, for instance, one would be able to read and read. Herr Dremmel had explained 100 times about his laboratory, and he himself locked into it, and only asking to be left locked. Surely that was an admirable quality in a husband, that he kept himself locked up. And the parsonage was on the edge of the village, and the little garden at the back had nothing between it and the sunset and all God's other dear arrangements, except a solitary and long unused windmill. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning that her courage, however, altogether ebbed at the prospect of going home. What would it be like taking up her filialities again, and all of them henceforth so terribly tarnished? She would be a returning prodigal for whom no calf was killed, but who instead of the succulences of a more liberal age would be offered an awful opportunity of explaining her conduct to a father who would interrupt her the instant she began and do the explaining himself. How was she going to face it all alone? If only she could have been in love with Herr Dremmel. With what courage she would have faced her family then, if she had been in love with him and come to them her hand in his. If only he looked more like the lovers you see in pictures, like the one in Leighton's Wedded, for instance. A very beautiful picture, Ingeborg thought, but not like any of the Wedded in Redchester, so that if she couldn't be in love she could at least persuade herself she was. If only he had proper hair instead of just beaver. She liked him so much. She had even at particular moments of his conversation gone so far as to delight in him. But marriage? What was marriage? Why did they never talk about it at home? In the Bishop's palace it might, for all the mentioning it got, be one of the 7 deadly sins. You talked there of the married, and sometimes, but with reserve, of getting married, but marriage itself and what it was and meant was never discussed. She had received the impression, owing to these silences, that though it was God's ordinance, as her father in his official capacity at weddings reiterated, it was a reluctant ordinance, established apparently because there seemed no other way of getting round what appeared to be a difficulty. What was the difficulty? She had never in her busy life thought about it. Marriage had not concerned her. It would not be nice, she had felt, unconsciously adopting the opinion of her environment, for a girl who was not going to marry to get thinking of it. And it really had not interested her. she had quite naturally turned her eyes away. But now this question of facing her father, this need of being backed up, this longing to get away from things, forced her to look. Besides, she would have to give Herr Dremmel some sort of answer in the morning, and the facing of Herr Dremmel required courage too, of a different kind, but certainly courage. She was so reluctant to hurt or disappoint. It had seemed all her life the most beautiful of pleasures to give people what they wanted, to get them to smile, to see them look content. But suppose Herr Dremmel, before he could be got to smile and look content, wanted to clutch her again as he had clutched her on the top of the Rigi. She had very profoundly disliked it. She had been able to resent it there and get loose. But if she were married and he clutched, could she still resent? She greatly feared not. She greatly suspected, now she came to a calm consideration of it, that was what was the matter with marriage. It was a series of clutchings. Her father had no doubt realised this as she was realising it now, and very properly didn't like it. You couldn't expect him to. That was why he wouldn't talk about it. In this she was entirely at one with him. But perhaps Herr Dremmel didn't like it either. Wasn't she rather jumping at conclusions in imagining that he did? Hadn't he after all clutched rather in anger up there than in anything else? And what about his earnest wish, so often explained, to be left all day locked up in his laboratory? And what about his praise that very afternoon of chill in human relationships? At that moment her eye was arrested by something white appearing slowly and with difficulty beneath her door. She sat up very straight and stared at it, watching its efforts to get over and past the edge of her mat. For an instant she wondered whether it were not a kind of insect ghost. Then she saw, as more of it appeared, that it was a letter. She held her breath while it struggled in. Nobody had ever pushed a letter under her door before. She grew happy instantly. What fun! Her heart beat quite fast with excitement while she waited to hear footsteps going away before getting up to fetch it. Herr Dremmel, however, must have been in his goloshes, objects from which he was seldom separated, for she heard nothing, and after a few seconds of breathless listening she got up with immense caution and went on tiptoe to the letter and picked it up. Why, she thought, pausing for a moment with a sort of solemnity before opening it, I suppose this is my first love letter. There was nothing on the envelope and no signature, and this was what it said: Little one, I wish to tell you that before going to my room tonight I instructed the hall porter to order a betrothal cake, properly iced and with what is customary in the matter of silver leaves, to be in the small salon adjoining the smoking room tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Since no man can be betrothed alone, it will be necessary that you should be there. Chapter 6. It was a perturbed betrothal. There were so many people at it. 7 ladies besides Ingeborg appeared in the small salon adjoining the smoking room next morning at 9 o'clock. What Herr Dremmel had done, being ignorant which was Ingeborg's room, and after laborious thought deciding that to demand her number of the hall porter later than dusk might very conceivably cast a slur on her reputation, young ladies being, as he well knew, of all living creatures the most easily slurred, was to write as many copies of the letter as there were doors on her landing and thrust them industriously one by one beneath each door, strong in the knowledge that she would in this manner inevitably get one of them. He was greatly pleased with this plan. It seemed of a beautiful simplicity and effectiveness. Being unaware of the context, he reasoned, no lady except the right one will be able to guess what the letter can possibly refer to. She will therefore throw it aside as an obvious mistake and think no more about it. But the ladies did think, and none of the inhabitants of the third floor, except Mr. Ascough, who never thought anything about anything, having discovered that if once you begin to think there is no end to it, and a dried and brittle little man lately pensioned off by the firm he had been clerk to, and taking his first trip on the Continent in a condition of profound uninterestedness, threw it aside. These two did, but the 7 ladies not only did not throw it aside, they read it many times, and instead of thinking no more about it, thought of nothing else. Even Mrs. Bawn, who had been a widow for 6 months and was heartily tired of it, was pleased. She liked particularly being addressed as little one. There was a blindness about this that suggested genuine feeling. She had not been so much pleased since her little Bawn, now half a year in glory, had told her one day before their marriage that he did not care what anybody said, he maintained that she was handsome. They all thought the letter very virile, and that nothing could be more gentlemanly than its restraint. 4 of them expected a different male member of the party to be waiting in the small salon. The remaining 3 expected Mr. Ascough. Mr. Ascough had a caressing way with pats of butter and the closing of the doors of filled flies that had before now led him on these tours into misapprehensions. He was long since married, but had omitted to mention it. The ladies, therefore, when they arrived in the small salon at 9 o'clock, did not find Mr. Ascough nor any of the other 4 friends they expected. They found, surprisingly, each other, and standing thick and black near a decorated table at the window, and scowling in a fresh astonishment every time the door opened and another lady came in, that very undesirable fellow tourist, the German gentleman. Each one immediately knew it was Ingeborg who had been written to, and that the letter had gone astray. Each one also thought she knew that Ingeborg had not got the letter and would not come, but each one, except Mrs. Bawn, was helped to cover up her shock by being sure the others did not know of it, and the custom of life lying heavy on them, they were able, after one little start on first seeing Herr Dremmel, to drift into the corners of the room and pretend that what they had come for was books. Except Mrs. Bawn. Mrs. Bawn saw, stared, turned on her heel, and went out again volcanically, and the corridor shook to her departing footsteps and to the angry unintentional rhymes she was making aloud with words like hoax and jokes. With astonishment and disgust Herr Dremmel saw the 7 ladies accumulate. It was most unfortunate that on that morning of all mornings the small salon, so invariably empty, should be visited. His inexperienced mind did not connect their appearance with his letters. It never occurred to him that his reasoning as to what they would do on receiving them could possibly be wrong. Nor did he, as he watched the door open and shut 7 times, and 7 times admit the wrong woman, guess that their presence, if Ingeborg came, would immensely help his betrothal. the ladies fingering dusty Tauchnitzes and magazines and eyeing the table in the window with heads as much averted as could be combined with the seeing of it, gradually found the shock they had had being soothed by the interest they felt in what Herr Dremmel would do when he realized that that unladylike Miss Bullivant, all unaware of what was waiting for her, was not coming. Now that they were there they might as well stay and see the end of it. It was really very interesting in its way, so German, so unlike, thank goodness, what English people ever did. Would he stand there all day, they wondered, with that really most improperly suggestive cake, so very like a christening cake? One or two of them sat down squarely on the sofas behind months-old magazines, round whose edges they peeped, making it clear to the unhappy man that they, at least, intended to stay there. And they all coughed a little every now and then in the way a waiting congregation coughs in church. Then the door was pushed open with the jerk of somebody who is either in a hurry or has come to a sudden determination. And who should appear but Miss Bullivant? A thrill ran through the seven ladies, and they instantly became, behind their magazines, stiff with excitement. Chance! What a chance! She had chanced to look in. It was like a play, dear me, thought each of the seven. And Ingeborg, who believed as lately as the last moment on the doormat outside that she had only come in order to tell Herr Dremmel she was not coming, when she saw the cake, very white and bridal, on a white cloth with white flowers in pots round it, and on either side of it a bottle with a white ribbon round its neck, and on the other, for the sake of symmetry, two glasses, was staggered. How could she, who so much loved to please, to make happy, cruelly hurt him, spoil his little feast, wipe out the glow, the immense relief that beamed from his face when he saw her? She turned round quickly, realizing the presence of the seven ladies. Amazed, she stared at them, mechanically counting them. How could she make him ridiculous, humiliate him, before all those women? Hesitating, torn, poised on the tip of flight, she stood there. Her hand was on the door to open it again and run, but Herr Dremmel's simplicity came to his help more effectually than the cunningest plans. He forgot the ladies, and stepping forward, took her hand in his, and quite simply kissed her forehead, sealing her then and there, with the perfect frankness of his countrymen when engaged in legitimate courtship, as his betrothed. He then slipped a ring he wore on his little finger on to her thumb, that being the only bit of her hand he could find that it would stay on, and he being free from prejudices in the matter of fingers, and the thing, at least so he supposed, was done. Ingeborg, in her bewilderment, let these things happen to her. Her thoughts, as she stood being betrothed, were jerking themselves into a perfect tangle of knots. She was astonished at the tricks life stoops to. A cake and the eyes of seven women. Her whole future being decided by a cake and the eyes of seven women. Oh no, it couldn't be. It was only that she couldn't stop now. Impossible utterly to stop now. She had never dreamt she wouldn't find him alone. These women were all witnesses. He had kissed her before them all. His methods were really overwhelming. Suppose her father could see her. But the kiss had been administered very ceremoniously. It had been quite cooling, such as one as even a bishop might feel justified in applying to the brow of a sick person or a young child. Later, at a more convenient time, when the pathetic cake was out of sight, when these women were out of earshot, she would tell him she hadn't meant. Amazingly, she found herself advancing towards the cake with Herr Dremmel, and standing in front of it with him hand in hand. Oh, the mischief people got into who came up to London to dentists! She now saw what provincial dentists were for. They kept you in pain, and pain kept you out of mischief. For the first time she understood what her spirit had till then refused to accept, the teaching so popular with the Bishop that pain was a necessary part of the scheme of things. Of course, you were safe so long as you were in pain. In that condition the very nearest you could get to the most seductive temptation was to glance at it palely with a sick taste. And you stayed at home and were grateful for kindnesses. It was only when you hadn't anything the matter with you that you ran away from your family and went to Lucerne and took up with a strange man, positively to the extent of letting him promise to marry you. Somebody coughed so close behind her that it made her jump. She turned round nervously, Herr Dremmel still holding her hand, and beheld the 7 ladies flocked about her for all the world like 7 bridesmaids. They had hastily consulted together in whispers, while she was being led away to the cake, as to whether they ought not to congratulate her. Their hearts were touched by the respectful ceremony with which Herr Dremmel had conducted his betrothal. It had had the solemn finality of a marriage, and what woman can look on at a marriage unmoved? They had agreed in whispers that this was one of those moments in which one lets bygones be bygones. The 2 at the altar, they meant at the cake, had no doubt said many terrible and vulgar tillings, and had behaved in a way no lady and gentleman would, the girl, for instance, openly admitting she had run away from home. But what they were doing now, at least, was beyond reproach, and by uniting, 2 blacks were, after all, in spite of what people said about it not being possible, going to make 1 white. At any rate, it was charitable to hope so. So they cleared their throats and wished her joy. "Thank you," said Ingeborg, a little faintly, looking from one to the other. "It's so kind of you, but—" Then they shook hands with Herr Dremmel and said they were sure they wished him joy too, and he thanked them with propriety and bows. "Such a thing has never happened on a dance tour before." "Oh, no, never before at all, I'm sure," said the most elderly lady nervously, with a number of nods. "There isn't time enough, that's what I sometimes think," said the young lady who had hurried her companion away to the sunset the evening before. "What's a week?" And she stared at the cake and frowned. "Dent's had a funeral once," said a square small lady who kept her hands plunged in the pockets of a grey jersey. "Now, Miss Jewkes, really," protested the elderly lady, "one doesn't mention—" "Well, it wasn't their fault, Miss Andrews. They didn't want to have it, I'm sure. It was a gentleman from Gipsy Hill—" "What a beautiful cake," hastily interrupted the elderly lady. "Funny thing, I sometimes think," continued Miss Jewkes, "to go for a holiday and die instead." "Those silver leaves," said the elderly lady, raising her voice, "I call them dainty." "It's like a wedding cake, isn't it?" said the young lady of the sunset, peering close at it with a face of gloom. "Will you not, Ingeborg," said Herr Dremmel, calling her for the first time by her name, "cut the cake? And perhaps these ladies will do us the honour of tasting it." She did not recognise him in this persistent ceremoniousness. Every trace of his usual lax behaviour was gone, his ease and familiarity of speech, and he was as stiff and correct and grave as if he were laying a foundation stone or opening a museum. They were the manners, though she did not know it, which all Germans are trained to produce on public occasions. "Oh, thank you. Oh, you're really very kind. Oh, thank you very much, I'm sure." There was a murmur of awkward and reluctant thanks. The seven ladies were not at all certain that their cordiality ought to stretch as far as cake. They had been moved by an impulse that did honour to their womanliness to offer congratulations, but they did not for all that forget the dreadful things the couple had constantly been heard talking about, and the many clear proofs it had provided that it was what dense tours were accustomed to describe as no class. And though they all liked cake and were getting steadily hungrier as the Dent week drew to its close, they were doubtful as to the social wisdom of eating it. It would be very unpleasant if these people, encouraged, were later on to presume, if they were to try to use the eaten cake as a weapon for forcing their way into English society. If, in a word, when the tour got back to England, they were to want to call. So they took the cake reluctantly that Ingeborg, in a sort of dream, cut and offered them, and with even more reluctance they sipped the wine in which the German gentleman requested them to drink the newly betrothed couple's health. "But," said Ingeborg, trying to rouse herself even at this 11th hour, "true, there are not enough glasses." "I will ring for more," was the way Herr Dremmel finished her sentence for her. The immense official promptness of him, she felt, numbed. And when the glasses were brought there was another ceremony, a clinking of Herr Dremmel's glass with each glass in turn, his heels together as in the days of his soldiering, his body stiff and his face a miracle of solemnity. And before drinking he made a speech, the Asti held high in front of him, in which he thanked the ladies for their good wishes on behalf of his betrothed, Miss Ingeborg Bullivant, whose virtues he dwelt upon singly and at length in resounding periods, before proceeding to assure those present of his firm resolve to prove, by the devotion of the rest of his life, the extremity of his gratitude for the striking proof she had given before them all of her confidence in him. And every sentence seemed to set another and heavier seal on her as a creature undoubtedly bound to marry him. Dimly she began to realise something of the steely grip of a German engagement. She wondered whether there were any more room left on her forehead for further seals. She felt that it must be covered with great red things scrawled over with the inscription Dremmel's. Well, she was after all not a parcel to be picked up and carried away by the first person who found her lying about, and the minute she was alone with him she must tell him that what she had really come down for, though appearances were certainly by this time rather against her, was to refuse him. She would be as gentle as possible, but she would be plain and firm. The minute these women left them alone she would tell him. With a start she saw that the women were leaving them alone, and that the minute had come. She wanted them not to go. She wanted to keep them there at any cost. She even made a step after them as the last one, nodding to the end, went out and shut the door, but Herr Dremmel still had hold of her hand. When the door had finally shut she turned to him quickly. Her head was thrown back, her eyes were full of a screwed up courage. "But you know," she began, determined to clear things up, however much it might hurt them both. And again he promptly finished her sentence for her, this time by enfolding her in his arms and kissing her with a largeness and abundance which no bishop, her mind flashed as her body stood stiff with surprise and horror, could possibly approve. She felt engulfed. She felt she must be disappearing altogether. He seemed infinitely capacious and soft. "Oh, but I can't. I won't. Oh, stop. Oh, stop. It's a mistake." She tried to get out of his grasps. "My little wife," was all the notice Herr Dremmel took of that. Section 2